The final night of the year arrives quietly. A warm room, soft light, laughter touching like thin glass. Outside, winter stands still, offering no congratulations, no farewell. And somewhere in the air, a familiar feeling lingers, difficult to name. When the clock hand reaches midnight, something will be different. Not because the sky changes color, not because the earth begins a new season, only because a number turns to another page. And yet billions of people hold their breath, as if standing before an invisible door. There are rituals no one remembers the reason for anymore, but they continue to function, silently, like memory. And memory, at times, is stronger than reason. That moment does not need explanation to hold its power. It only needs to be waited for. In the final seconds of the year, people tend to slow down, not because time itself moves more slowly, but because meaning becomes compressed. Everything that has passed begins to line up in the mind. Everything that has not yet arrived takes shape like a shadow. People look back, people look ahead. Few remain where they are. The final night of the year becomes a threshold, and before every threshold, humans carry more than necessary. There is no natural signal declaring that this is a beginning. No sunrise, no turning of the seasons, no green shoot breaking through cold soil. And yet the sensation of starting again appears, reliably, like a habit passed from one hand to another. Perhaps because humans need boundaries to package time. They need a stopping point to say, the old has closed. They need a door to believe that what lies beyond, though unseen, is still worth crossing. In many ancient cultures, moments of transition were treated with care. Dusk, dawn, the changing of seasons, the line between water and land, between village and forest. These places never belonged fully to either side. They were thin, and because they were thin, they were easily filled with ritual. The final night of the year carries that same thinness. It does not fully belong to the old day, nor has it reached the new. It hangs suspended, long enough for people to place upon it their hopes, their worries, their promises, and the words they never found time to speak aloud. Perhaps that is why this night is always wrapped in artificial light. Lamps, fireworks, screens, as if humanity fears that the darkness might raise another question deeper than the celebration itself. If this ritual did not exist, how would time move? If there were no day called new, would people know when to stop and when to continue? And if this door exists only in the mind, who stands guard before it? To understand that, one must slow down further. One must remain longer at the threshold itself. For before humans learned to count down, they learned to fear the moments in between, moments that belonged nowhere, where everything could drift into another shape if left unnamed. And from that vague fear, the idea of the threshold was born, carrying with it the need to imagine a guardian, even if that guardian exists only as a silhouette in the collective memory. From very early on, humans learned to fear moments that belonged nowhere, not because they were dangerous in a physical sense, but because they lacked shape. Dawn is no longer night, yet it is not fully day. Dusk is no longer day, but darkness has not yet taken its place. The changing of seasons carries the confusion of the land itself, when trees no longer know whether to sleep or to wake. These moments have no clear borders, and for that reason, they are always wrapped in ritual. In anthropology, this condition is called the state of the in-between, a thin zone where ordinary rules loosen their grip. At these thresholds, people feel more vulnerable, but also more capable of change. This is why rites of passage, funerals, weddings, and initiations so often occur at moments of transition. Ritual does more than mark change. It protects the individual from the uncertainty of not knowing who they are, once the old has departed and the new has not yet taken form. The final night of the year carries precisely this quality of a threshold. It is not a complete ending, nor a natural beginning. It exists as a narrow opening in the current of time, where people are allowed to pause and look back at themselves. But to look back for too long invites regret. To look forward too soon invites anxiety. And so ritual appears as a frame. It tells people, stand here, do this, count, raise a glass, kiss, say something about the future, as if by following the correct sequence of actions, uncertainty itself can be domesticated. In ancient cultures, thresholds were always watched, not always by a god with a clear name and face, sometimes only by a spirit, a symbol, a story repeated long enough to feel real. The guardian of the threshold was not necessarily an obstacle. They were a witness, someone who ensured that crossing did not happen in complete silence. Because silence, at these moments, was considered dangerous. It left too much space for fear to speak to itself. The final night of the year, even in the modern world, still preserves this structure. The difference is that the guardian no longer stands in a forest or by the edge of a river. The guardian stands in an idea, in the clock, in the calendar. People no longer need to know the guardian's name. They only need to know that there is a moment that must be marked. And to mark it, there must be an image, a symbol, a familiar face upon which the gaze can rest. Because when humans stand before a threshold, what they fear most is not stepping forward. What they fear is remaining in the middle, belonging neither to what has passed nor to what is about to arrive. That fear is what makes them accept the images handed to them, the symbols placed carefully in position, the faces chosen to represent the act of looking back and looking ahead. And from here, at the edge of the January threshold, an ancient image begins to emerge. A face that does not look straight ahead, a face turned in two directions, as if standing at the threshold itself forces the gaze to split in half. In Roman mythology, a threshold is never empty. It is always guarded by an image, not to threaten, not to punish, but to remind that no passage is anonymous. That image bears the name Janus, the god of doors, of entrances, of beginnings and endings. Yet Janus does not face outward toward the world. He faces two directions at once. One face looks backward, one face looks forward. No face looks directly at the moment that is unfolding. This is not a flaw. It is the essence of the symbol. Janus does not represent the future, nor does he represent the past. He represents the tension of being pulled between two directions of sight. It is this tension that gives the threshold its weight. At a deeper level, Janus is not a figure meant to be believed in or worshipped. He is a psychological diagram, a way humans learn to confront transition. When standing before a door, the gaze rarely rests in the present. It turns backward toward what has already passed, searching for explanation, regret, or the comfort of familiarity. At the same time, it shoots forward, constructing images, expectations, or unnamed anxieties. These two forces do not oppose each other. They coexist, and between them, the present moment grows thin as mist. The final night of the year is when Janus becomes most vivid in the human mind. Without speaking his name, behavior still follows the same structure. People look back at the old year, not to understand it, but to inventory it. They look toward the new year, not to feel it, but to predict it. Rarely is the question asked, where am I, right now? Rarely does the gaze pause on the sensation of breathing, of standing, of existing in a very real cold night. In the ancient world, Janus was tied to physical gates, city gates, temple doors, entrances to sacred space. Each time one passed through, it was understood that one order was being left behind for another. But in the modern world, the gate has become abstract. It lives in the calendar, in the clock, in the moment of midnight agreed upon as a turning point. Janus no longer stands in stone or bronze. He stands in habit. What is striking is that Janus was never described as an all-powerful god. He did not create time. He did not control the seasons. His role was far more modest, to witness movement, to give shape to passage. And yet this modesty is what makes him enduring. Wherever humans require a boundary, Janus appears again under another name, another symbol, but with the same divided gaze. When the gaze splits, presence thins. And when presence thins, humans begin to seek actions large enough to compensate, counting down, shouting, light, sound, as if the moment is not filled with motion, it might collapse into itself. But this raises a quieter question. If Janus is only a mirror reflecting how humans look at time, what happens when millions of gazes split at once, in the same rhythm? The answer does not lie with the god. It lies in the collective behavior that begins to form around that moment, a sequence of movements repeated long enough to become ritual and broad enough to encompass the world. And when a ritual must be performed together, humans reach for the simplest way to synchronize, fixing their eyes on a single number, counting down. 10, 9, 8. The numbers fall, not because they carry weight, but because humans give them rhythm. Counting down is one of the oldest actions used to face what cannot be controlled. Long before precise clocks existed, people counted footsteps, drumbeats, breaths. Counting does not change time, but it makes humans feel as though they are moving with time, rather than being left behind by it. On the final night of the year, this action reaches its most complete form. Millions of people, in different places, direct their gaze toward a single motion. The number does not merely signal a moment, it becomes an anchor. When everything else feels too vast, a year that has passed, a year that has not yet arrived, people need something small enough to hold on to. A descending sequence of numbers, clear, definite, without ambiguity. What matters is not the act of counting itself. It is synchronization. Each time zone has its own moment, yet the structure remains identical. Count, wait, hold breath, and explode, as if the world is rehearsing the same movement, repeating it in waves, from one place to another, a ritual without instructions. Everyone knows what to do, even though no one remembers who taught it. In ancient communities, synchronization always carried meaning tied to survival. Singing together, dancing together, praying together. A shared rhythm created safety by softening individual boundaries. When many people do the same thing, private fear becomes easier to bear. The countdown on New Year's Eve operates on this same logic. It gathers scattered emotions, regret, hope, exhaustion, anticipation, into a single mass, large enough to be felt as us. Yet something subtle occurs in the process. When millions of eyes fix on the numbers, the present moment is compressed into the final seconds. Everything outside the rhythm of the count is pushed aside. The sensation of where one stands, how one breathes, what it feels like to exist in a particular body, temporarily yields to collective suspense. People are no longer inside their own time. They step into shared time. The countdown creates the illusion of a common crossing point, where everyone passes through together. In truth, no one crosses with anyone else. Each person stands in a different room, a different city, a different life. The only thing that is shared is the ritual, and ritual, when repeated long enough, can substitute for direct experience. It allows people to believe they have passed through something, even when no one can clearly name what that thing was. At a deeper level, counting down is how humans give shape to waiting. Waiting is an uncomfortable state. It exposes helplessness. But when divided into 10 numbers, that helplessness becomes tolerable. Each number passing feels like progress, even though no real distance is being closed. And when the final number disappears, the space is filled immediately. Sound, light, shouting, as if the world fears that, if noise does not arrive fast enough, the empty moment that just opened might speak something unwanted. Yet before the cheering begins, there is always a very brief instant that almost no one notices. A slit of silence, where the numbers are gone, and meaning has not yet arrived. It is within that slit that midnight begins to take shape, not as a point in time, but as a blurred zone, where the old day has withdrawn, and the new day has not yet set foot. Midnight is not the natural beginning of anything. The sun does not rise. The earth does not change its season. The human body receives no clear biological signal to say, a new cycle has begun. And for that very reason, midnight became, early on, a symbolic void. A moment not endorsed by nature, yet perfectly suited for humans to place upon it the meanings they require. In many ancient traditions, midnight is considered a thin hour, not because it is dangerous, but because it lacks an anchor. It lies between 2 days, belonging fully to neither. When light has withdrawn and darkness has not yet thickened into deep sleep, human awareness becomes more easily influenced, tired, but not resting, awake, but no longer sharp. This is when images drift most easily into the mind, because the barriers of reason have thinned along with the light. Placing the turning of the year at midnight was not a random choice. It creates the sensation that the old has died before the new has had time to be born. A very narrow gap, where 2 states overlap. Humans stand within it feeling both loss and hope, letting go while reaching forward. Midnight allows these opposing emotions to coexist without explanation. If the new year began at dawn, everything would feel different. Light carries continuity. It makes clear that night is only a phase, not an ending. Midnight does not offer that reassurance. It cuts across. It conceals the connecting line. And when the connection can no longer be seen, humans more easily believe they are crossing a true boundary, rather than simply moving through another moment in a long sequence. In folk belief, midnight is often treated as the hour when unseen things draw closer, not necessarily ghosts or supernatural forces. Sometimes it is only memory, thoughts pushed aside during the day return when everything grows quiet. Questions about time, age, and the direction of one's life often choose midnight to appear, because daytime is too loud to hear them. The final night of the year amplifies this sensation, not only because it is late, but because it carries the idea of the last of a cycle, the last of a way of naming time. The feeling of lastness always makes things more fragile than usual. It leads people to place great meaning on small acts, an embrace, a wish, a promise whispered inwardly, never certain to be repeated when morning comes. For this reason, midnight becomes the perfect ground for ritual. It does not argue. It does not object. It offers no evidence. It simply opens a darkness wide enough for humans to project into it whatever they carry. And within that darkness, when emotion has softened and awareness has lost its edge, actions that seem simple begin to take on symbolic weight. When the clock hand reaches the peak of midnight, the countdown is over. But the ritual is not. It has only shifted into another form, one that is closer, warmer, more confirming. This is the moment when people do not merely stand beside one another, but begin to touch, to raise glasses, to exchange small signs that affirm they have crossed this threshold together. After midnight, the world does not pause to think. It moves immediately. Sound floods the space that has just opened. Light erupts. Bodies draw closer, as if a single missed beat might cause the feeling of having crossed to dissolve. This is the moment when ritual leaves the realm of numbers and enters the realm of touch. Glasses are raised almost by reflex. No one needs to be told. No explanation is required. This gesture is far older than it appears on the surface. In ancient cultures, lifting a cup was not merely about drinking. It was a way of acknowledging one another's presence, a way of saying, "We are here, in the same moment, witnessing the same passage." Alcohol, with its ability to soften sensation and widen emotion, becomes a conduit. It does not create meaning, but it makes meaning easier to receive. Language still carries a faint trace of this. Spirits, a word used for strong drink, is also a word for breath, essence, life itself. Not because alcohol contains a soul, but because humans have long associated altered states of awareness with the feeling of touching something beyond the ordinary. On the final night of the year, when the fatigue of an entire cycle has accumulated, alcohol permits release. The kiss follows soon after. It is not always romantic. Sometimes it is only a brief touch, an embrace, a moment of contact sufficient to say, "We passed through together." In many ancient rites, touch served as confirmation. It was a seal, a way of marking that the transition did not occur in isolation. Humans require another body to feel fully present in such a moment. What matters is that these actions happen after midnight, not before. Before, there is waiting. After, there is confirmation. As if counting and crossing were not enough on their own, a more human gesture is required to complete the passage. A wish, a touch, a smile exchanged in the relief that the threshold has been crossed without incident. Beneath this warmth, however, something more subtle is taking place. When people raise a glass, when they kiss, they are not only celebrating a moment, they are acknowledging a shared order, a rhythm agreed upon, a way of naming time that everyone accepts, even without believing in it completely. Ritual does not demand full conviction. It only requires participation. This is not deception. It is a social mechanism. Humans create shared moments to lessen the sense of solitude before forces larger than themselves. But when this mechanism repeats year after year, it begins to carry additional weight. Small acts, once meant only to connect, gradually come to be understood as signs of a great beginning. And when that beginning is confirmed by touch, by intoxication, by the silent agreement of the crowd, it becomes harder to question. To question it now would break the atmosphere. It would expose the fragility of the moment, and so people usually do not ask. They raise their glasses, They touch one another. They smile. And within the noise of celebration, something else is quietly laid in place. The feeling that something has been agreed upon, even without a signature, without words spoken aloud, only consent expressed through action. And once that consent has been given, the ritual can move into its next phase, where humans turn back toward memory, name what has passed, and use the past as an opening line for what is yet to come. After the clinking of glasses and the hurried embraces, the ritual often slows. The volume drops, breathing grows more even, and then, in many places around the world, a familiar melody begins to rise. Not a song of tomorrow, but a song of what has already passed. Lyrics that speak of old time, of bonds once held, of things that have gone, yet have not fully disappeared. This is no accident. When humans stand before a named beginning, they tend to turn first toward the past, not to cling to it, but to ensure that they have existed. Memory serves as evidence. It says, there was a path that led here, that this moment does not float in emptiness. It has roots, even if those roots lie in days already closed. Songs of the final night rarely speak of victory. They speak of remembering old friends, remembering earlier times, remembering promises left unkept, remembering faces no longer present in the room. Within the structure of ritual, this is the sanctioned glance backward. Not a cold inventory, but a softened gaze, carried by music. Music allows memory to pass without judgment. At a deeper level, memory on the final night is not only personal recollection, it is collective memory, a sense that humans do not step into the future alone. Those who came before, whether still living or existing only in remembrance, are invited back into this moment, not to be held, but to bear witness, to say, this cycle has been lived through before, and because of that, the new cycle can be entered with less fear. In symbolic psychology, memory often appears at thresholds as a silent guide. It reminds that every beginning carries the echo of previous beginnings. There is no absolute separation. Even when humans say a new year, what is actually carried forward are habits, scars, unresolved desires. The song for the past creates space for these things to be acknowledged, even if only for a few minutes. What is striking is that memory on this night is usually shared. People sing together, even when they do not remember all the words. One voice joins another. Imperfection is accepted. The purpose is not performance. The purpose is co-presence. When many voices overlap, individual boundaries soften. Private memory blends into shared memory. And in that blending, the sense of standing alone before time briefly subsides. Yet memory has another side. It can weigh down the step. When the past is summoned without a place to set it down, it becomes a burden rather than a foundation. The final night, therefore, always oscillates between two poles. On one side, the comfort of remembering. On the other, the risk of becoming stuck. And to avoid remaining too long in recollection, the ritual requires another transition. It is here, after the past has been named and softened by music, that humans begin to turn toward a different action, one directed forward. No longer a song, no longer a touch, but a whispered phrase or a clear declaration aimed at what has not yet happened. And in this action, a familiar concept begins to appear, carrying both hope and pressure, the promise made for the year to come. After memory has been summoned and set down through music, the ritual does not end. It requires a final movement to close the circle, an action aimed squarely forward, no longer toward what has passed, and not yet toward what is happening, but toward what is believed to be coming. This is where the promise appears. The promise of the final night is rarely spoken aloud at first. It often begins very small, a fleeting thought, a sentence whispered inwardly as the music fades, an image of a different version of oneself, standing somewhere ahead, in a year that has not yet taken shape. People do not call this ritual, they call it hope. But hope, when repeated at the right moment, in the right setting, through the right sequence of actions, begins to take on the structure of ritual without ever being named. This promise almost always points toward correction. It rarely says, remain as you are. It says, be different, better, lighter, stronger, as if the moment just crossed has left a small fracture, enough for humans to believe they can step out of an old form if they choose the correct moment to begin. And no moment is considered more correct than the final night of the year. when the entire world has just agreed that one cycle has closed. What is striking is that this promise does not arise in complete silence. It is carried by the atmosphere that came before it. Synchrony, light, alcohol, memory, the sense of not being alone in the desire to change. When many people stand before a door called the New Year, individual desire dissolves into shared desire. The promise becomes easier to form because it no longer feels entirely private. Yet it is here that a subtle shift occurs. The promise of the final night rarely begins with what people have. It begins with what is lacking, not disciplined enough, not calm enough, not brave enough, not aligned with the image one wishes to become. No one is forced to think this way, but the atmosphere of summation makes this perspective feel natural. When an entire year is placed on the scale, what weighs more heavily are often the things left undone. In this context, the promise becomes a way to balance the sense of lack. It says, this will be corrected, that the gap just recognized will not be left unattended, that the new year will carry an opportunity to fill it. And because the promise points toward the future, it brings immediate relief. Simply thinking it, or speaking it, allows people to feel as though they are already moving in the right direction. But the promise of the final night does not stand alone. It is born within a complete sequence, waiting, crossing, confirming, remembering, and then reaching forward. Each step before it prepares the ground. And because it is placed at the correct point in ritual, this promise carries more weight than promises made on ordinary days. It is treated as a marker, a new line drawn across time. Still, like everything that appears at a threshold, the promise is thin. It has no clear shape yet. It exists more as a feeling than as a plan, more as belief than as a defined path. And for that reason, it is easily carried away once the ritual ends, once the lights dim, once the night gives way to a morning not very different from yesterday. But before that happens, before the promise dissolves into ordinary life, a quiet question needs to be asked. Not whether the promise will be kept, but where the promise truly comes from a natural rhythm of life, or from the way humans have been taught to look back at time itself. And to answer that, one must step back once more out of the room, out of the final night, to look at a place where the idea of beginning once stood in a very different position. No one enters the new year intending to break a promise. The promise of the final night is born in the best state a person can reach at that moment. There is hope, there is resolve, there is the feeling that a boundary has just been crossed. But as the first days of the year pass, that atmosphere begins to thin. The lights are put away, the music falls silent, the alcohol fades, and ordinary life returns, carrying no sign that it knows about the promise that was just made. Winter remains, cold mornings, old habits, familiar pressures. There is no ritual accompanying people through these days. No countdown, no cheering, only a repeated rhythm, slow and steady. Within this setting, the promise begins to reveal its natural weakness. It is born from emotion, but it requires structure to survive, and that structure is rarely provided. The break does not happen all at once. It occurs quietly. A day missed, a morning that does not begin as planned, a small delay, reasonable enough to avoid guilt. But these small delays, when stacked together, begin to erode the original feeling. The promise does not vanish. It fades. And when it fades, it changes shape. What is striking is that the sense of failure often arrives before any clear behavioral change occurs. People do not fail because they tried and did not succeed. They fail because the distance between the promised image and lived reality feels too great. The promise was placed at the threshold of a new year, but life unfolds in unmarked days. Without ritual to support it, the promise must stand on its own. Most cannot. At a deeper level, the promise of the final night often carries an unspoken assumption that change requires a special moment to begin, that there are days that are right and days that are not yet sufficient. When this assumption meets the reality of winter, when everything slows, when body and mind both conserve energy, tension emerges, not because people are weak, but because they are forcing a new rhythm onto a ground that is not ready. When the promise is not kept, the common response is not to question the promise itself. The response is to turn inward, to self-blame, to compare, to conclude that the problem lies within. And because the final night ritual has tied the promise to the idea of starting over, failing to keep it is easily understood as missing an opportunity, as if a door opened and the person standing before it did not step through quickly enough. Yet a closer look reveals that it is not the promise that weakens. It is the context that gives birth to it that does not last. The ritual ends too soon for the demands of real change. It creates an emotional peak, then withdraws, leaving people alone with a promise that has not yet taken root. In this cycle, the sense of lack is not resolved. It is only postponed. And when the next year arrives, the same ritual opens again, the same threshold, the same promise, perhaps spoken in different words. The cycle repeats, not because people fail to learn. It repeats because the framing of the problem never changes. For before asking why promises do not survive the winter, a deeper question must be asked: whether the final night of the year is truly the right place to set a beginning at all. And to answer that, one must look beyond the room, beyond the present winter, and return to rhythms of time, once bound tightly to the earth, to light, and to the slow turning of life outside. If one leaves the warm room of the final night and steps outside, the first thing to notice is that nature is entirely unaware that a cycle has just been declared, ended. Winter keeps its rhythm. Trees sleep. The ground hardens. Light is short and cold. There is no sign that this is a favorable moment to begin something new. And for most of human history, beginnings were never placed here. Cultures that lived close to the land learned to listen to time differently. They did not search for a special day to change their lives. They watched for the return of light, for ice to melt, for green shoots strong enough to break through cold soil. The spring equinox, the winter solstice, the new moon, the coming of floods, these markers did not need global agreement. They spoke through visible change. When the season arrived, the body knew. When it left, the body knew that too. Within this rhythm, beginnings were not decisions. They were responses. Seeds were planted when the soil allowed it. Herds were moved when grass appeared. Festivals were held when daylight grew long enough to remain outdoors. Change occurred because the conditions were ready, not because humans wished it to happen sooner. And because of that, beginnings felt natural, requiring no grand promise to sustain them. Compared to this rhythm, placing a beginning in the heart of winter is a reversal. Not a reversal of nature, but of how humans tell the story of time. Instead of waiting for conditions, people began to create markers. Instead of allowing change to emerge from within, they designated a day to name it. This approach is not wrong. It is simply more familiar to the mind than to the body. Once time is separated from nature, it requires another structure to hold it in place. Calendars appear, clocks appear, straight lines replace circles. Time no longer returns with the seasons, but advances forward in even units. Within this structure, beginning is no longer tied to sprouting, but to turning a page. A new page is treated as opportunity, even if the surrounding conditions remain unchanged. This creates a subtle paradox. Humans are encouraged to begin again at the very moment when all biological signals point toward conserving energy. The body wants to slow, the mind wants to draw inward, yet the story of the new year says, accelerate, set goals, become someone else. The gap between the narrated rhythm and the lived rhythm opens here. In ancient societies, rites of beginning were often extended. They did not end after a single night. Festival seasons stretched across entire transitional periods, giving people time to adjust. No one expected immediate transformation. Change was allowed to grow slowly, alongside light and temperature. In that structure, promises, if they existed at all, were nourished by the surrounding environment, rather than abandoned when the ritual ended. Seen this way, the question is no longer why promises of the final night fade so easily. The question becomes, what happened when beginnings were separated from seasons, when time began to be counted in numbers rather than felt through the body? For it is at this point of separation that humans began to require other symbols to compensate for the loss of connection. Images, names, guardians standing before the abstract doors of time, ready to give each month a face toward which the human gaze could turn. A small trace still remains embedded in language, like a fossil not yet erased. September was once the 7th month, October the 8th, November the 9th, December the 10th. These names are not wrong, only their positions were moved. Before the year was reset into the heart of winter, The cycle once opened at a different moment when light was increasing, when the ground began to soften, when setting out required no imagination. In that earlier structure, the year began in a season of action, not because people were more optimistic, but because the context allowed it. Roads were drier, days were longer, the work of land and the movement of armies could begin. A beginning was not a promise, it was a concrete step, and because that step occurred under favorable conditions, it required fewer symbols for reassurance. The shift in the year's position did not happen all at once, nor did it occur quietly. It was the result of growing administrative need. As territories expanded, as taxes had to be collected on schedule, as armies needed coordinated mobilization, time had to become predictable. Seasons were no longer precise enough. Light was no longer synchronized enough. A fixed marker, independent of land and sky, became appealing. Placing the year in winter solved many bureaucratic problems. It created a natural pause for accounting and review. It allowed numbers to be closed before a new cycle of activity began. But at the same time, it introduced a misalignment. The beginning was named at a moment when material life was slowing down. The idea of starting drifted away from direct experience and moved into abstraction. Here, symbols became more important. When people could no longer feel beginnings in their bodies, they needed to see them as images, a face, a name, a god of doors and months, not to rule time, but to help humans endure standing before a door with no visible hinges. January, with its face turned in two directions, became an anchor for a gaze stretched between what had passed and what had not yet arrived. This shift did not erase the old rhythm entirely. It overlaid it with a new grid. People still lived by seasons, but they learned to narrate their lives by years. They still sensed light, but they learned to wait for numbers to turn. Over time, the new story gained dominance. Beginnings were taught as decisions, no longer as responses, as declarations, no longer as movements. This explains why the ritual of the final night requires so many stages. Counting down, midnight, the raised glass, memory, the promise. Each step attempts to fill the gap between time that is named and time that is felt. When beginnings no longer rise naturally from soil and light, humans must construct them through ritual. But any structure that is built carries consequences. When the year begins at a point unfavorable for emergence, the promise must carry more than its share. It does not merely guide action, it must compensate for the environment's lack of readiness. And when the promise bears too much weight, what follows is not change, but another force, older, stricter, bound to limits, discipline, and measurement. A force that always waits behind every schedule, where time is no longer a cycle, but a lesson repeated until humans recognize how they are being taught. When time was no longer felt through soil and light, it needed to be held by a shared frame. And that frame, over time, became increasingly refined. The calendar was no longer only a tool for remembering dates. It began to serve another function, forcing every rhythm of life to pass through the same grid. Different seasons, different lands, different ways of living. All were gradually named through a single system, not to erase diversity, but to manage it. This standardization brought undeniable convenience. Trade became easier, records clearer. Distant communities could agree on a day without looking at one another's sky. But that convenience carried a soft cost, difficult to notice at first. When the calendar became the primary way of narrating time, natural markers slowly receded. They did not disappear. They simply lost their authority. Many communities once opened the year by the new moon, by the return of floods, by the planting season. When the shared calendar spread, those beginnings remained, but they were pushed into secondary roles. They became local festivals, family traditions, or cultural memory. Meanwhile, the official new year, the one written into documents, contracts, schools, and budgets, settled in the heart of winter, a beginning that did not need to know what the land was doing. This shift did not arrive through a single decree. It arrived through habit. People learned to wait for numbers to turn before allowing themselves to begin again. Children were taught that a new year meant a new chance. Adults learned to evaluate their lives in cycles of 12 months. Gradually, the feeling of "the year has ended" became more familiar than the feeling of The season has ended. Time was counted more through numbers than through the body. Within this structure, the ritual of the final night acts as adhesive. It gives life to the calendar's frame. It pours emotion into otherwise cold numbers. When millions of people perform the same sequence of actions, the calendar stops feeling like an abstract chart. It becomes experience, an experience strong enough to compensate for nature's absence in marking a beginning. Yet it is precisely here that another gap begins to open. When the shared calendar becomes the dominant rhythm, people are forced to adapt to it, even when their bodies are not ready. Winter calls for slowness. The calendar calls for beginnings. These two rhythms do not converse. They overlap. And in that overlap, pressure emerges. Pressure to move before strength is available. Pressure to renew while the ground is still frozen. Ritual attempts to soften this pressure with feeling, light, music, wishes. But once the ritual ends, the calendar remains. The numbers still turn. The months still advance. And people, alone, must carry their promises through days that offer no transitional signs. At this point, the calendar is no longer neutral. It begins to prescribe. It says, now is the time to be different. Now is the time to be better. Not everyone notices this shift. It unfolds slowly, across generations. But its consequence is clear. Beginning becomes an obligation. And when beginning is turned into obligation, it requires another force to sustain it. A force not rooted in seasons, but in limits. Not in emergence, but in discipline. A force that has always lingered at the edge of every schedule, and now begins to step into view bearing an ancient name bound to time, measurement, and lessons repeated without rest. When beginnings are no longer tied to seasons, humans require another force to keep time from slipping through their hands. This force is not loud. It does not rely on dazzling ritual. It works quietly through rhythm, through boundaries, through things that must be completed on schedule. In ancient myth, this force was given a name, Saturn. But at a deeper level, Saturn is not a character. He is the principle of limitation. Limits emerge when the circle is stretched into a line. When time no longer returns with the seasons, it begins to advance by schedule. Day follows day. Month follows month. Everything is measured, divided, placed into form. Within this structure, spontaneity becomes suspect, and discipline becomes a virtue. Not because humans enjoy control, but because once the natural rhythm is lost, a substitute rhythm is needed to prevent collapse. In ancient imagination, Saturn is associated with slowness, with weight, with lessons that cannot be avoided. He does not punish, he repeats. When something has not been understood, it returns in another form, carrying the same familiar feeling. This is how limitation teaches, not through instruction, but through experience. Not through sudden change, but through exhausting regularity. In modern life, this principle is everywhere, though rarely named. Deadlines, quotas, plans, targets. These words sound far removed from myth, yet they operate by the same logic. They insist that time must be used correctly, that every passing day carries a problem to be solved, and if the problem is not solved, it will return this time as increased pressure. Placing the beginning of the year in winter sharpens this principle. When nature calls for rest, structure calls for progress. The tension created by this clash demands explanation, and that explanation is often sought in personal discipline. People are taught that if they try hard enough, if they tighten themselves sufficiently, they can overcome the season's slowness. Limitation stops being a signal to pause. It becomes a challenge to defeat. But within Saturn's logic, limits are not meant to be conquered. They are meant to be heard. When humans attempt to override them through sheer will, the lesson does not disappear. It grows heavier. Failure does not arrive as catastrophe. It arrives as a loop. The same promise, the same pressure, the same sense of having stood here before. This explains why the promise of the final night so easily turns into self-blame when it is not kept. Not because people are weak, but because the promise was placed within a structure where limits are treated as enemies rather than guides. When beginnings are framed as obligations, discipline becomes a whip, and a whip, no matter how softly wielded, eventually erodes motivation. In many ancient cultures, limits were honored differently. Winter was not a time for expansion, but for contraction. Not for acceleration, but for storage. Discipline, if it existed, was the discipline of waiting, of not doing. When this rhythm is replaced by linear scheduling, limits lose their natural voice and are forced to speak through pressure. Saturn, as a principle, stands here, not as a ruler, but as the one who repeats the same lesson, year after year. That time is not meant only to be conquered, it is meant to be negotiated with. And when that dialogue is ignored, time teaches again, not faster, not slower, but at its own pace. To understand this, however, humans must look directly at how they have learned to listen to time through calendars, through numbers, and through the endless loops of promise and pressure. Most people do not learn how to wait for the new year as adults. They learn it much earlier. In childhood memory, the final night of the year is often a rare exception, allowed to stay up late, allowed to break the usual rhythm of daily life, told that tonight is special, not because of anything happening in nature, but because the clock is about to reach a different number. For a child, this is a powerful experience, not because they understand the meaning of years, but because they feel difference. Adults behave differently. The room is brighter, voices are louder, anticipation hangs in the air, and at the center of it all is a moment already designated, midnight, the moment everyone says something will happen. No one explains exactly what that something is, and no explanation is needed. Children learn by watching. They see that as the clock. Hand approaches that mark. Every gaze gathers that a countdown can make an entire room hold its breath. That immediately afterward, cheering erupts like a reward. The lesson is not in the content. It is in the structure. An external moment is granted the authority to decide meaning. In the early years, this lesson carries no negative weight. It is simply a rule. Some moments are marked as important, and to participate fully, one must wait for the right time. Follow the shared rhythm. Trust that the moment has value, even without knowing why. That trust is planted gently, without force, because it arrives wrapped in joy. Over time, the same structure repeats in different forms. The start of the school year, the end of the school year, birthdays, graduations. Each marker carries a similar message. Legitimate change requires a named day. Movement must be permitted from the outside, and when this lesson is repeated long enough, it becomes invisible. No one remembers where it was learned. The final night of the year, therefore, is not only an adult ritual, it is a quiet classroom, a place where children learn that time can give orders, that there are moments when it is not yet, and moments when it is now. That personal readiness matters less than whether the calendar has granted permission. This is not deliberate manipulation. It is how culture reproduces itself across generations. As people grow older, the lesson changes form. It is no longer about staying up late. It becomes waiting for the right time to begin, waiting for Monday, waiting for the first of the month, waiting for next year. Each delay carries the hope that this time it will be different, because this time the date is correct. But the date itself carries no energy. It only carries the meaning assigned to it. What this structure does not teach is how to listen to inner rhythm. It teaches synchronization with an external rhythm instead. Not because the inner rhythm does not exist, but because it is difficult to measure, difficult to teach, and impossible to standardize. The calendar is different. The calendar is simple. The calendar is the same for everyone, and so it becomes the default guide. By the time people reach adulthood and begin to blame themselves for failing to keep their New Year promises, few return to the first moment when this belief was planted. Few recognize that the feeling of needing a special day to begin is not instinct, but a habit learned very early. And when that habit meets pressure limits, discipline, lessons repeated, without rest, it begins to shape a relationship with time, no longer based on feeling, but on obligation. It is here that the sense of not enough starts to become a familiar language, not because people truly lack something, but because they have been taught to measure themselves against markers beyond their reach. And from that language, another cycle slowly forms, one in which each passing year is not only time lived, but time that must be proven to have been lived correctly. When the final night recedes, a familiar feeling often remains. Not loud, not clearly defined, just a quiet hollow, where people begin to measure themselves by what is missing. Not disciplined enough, not calm enough, not brave enough. The word "not yet" appears more often than already, and slowly, Not quite enough becomes a shared language, spoken in many places, in many forms. This language does not need to be taught directly. It grows out of a familiar structure. When time is narrated through milestones that must be reached, each milestone silently implies an ideal image. And when that image is suspended ahead, present reality is easily perceived as lacking, not because it truly is, but because it is being compared to a version that does not yet exist. This comparison happens quietly, but constantly enough to become habit. The end of the year is when this language speaks most clearly. The atmosphere of summation places everything on a scale. What has been done tends to pass quickly, treated as expected. What remains undone feels heavier, because it carries the sense of something missed. And because ritual has taught that this is the moment to look back, the feeling of being not quite enough is seen as valid. It is not challenged. It is shared. It is understood. At a deeper level, the language of lack is not only about behavior. It speaks about worth. When people repeatedly define themselves by what they have not achieved, they begin to believe that value lies ahead, not in the present, that they will be better, more deserving, once they reach a certain point. And because that point is always placed in the future, the feeling of being enough is postponed indefinitely. This creates a subtle paradox. Aspiration, which is a natural force, becomes entangled with self-doubt. The desire to grow no longer stands alone. It is accompanied by the fear of falling behind. In this language, motivation no longer comes from curiosity or joy, but from the pressure to compensate. And pressure, however discreet, makes every step heavier. Not every culture speaks this language. In structures tied to seasons, lack is understood differently. Winter is not considered the failure of summer. It is a necessary phase of the cycle. Slowness does not require justification. Pause does not demand a promise. But when seasonal rhythm is replaced by milestone rhythm, the space between markers is easily interpreted as personal error. The language of not quite enough thus becomes the bridge between promise and pressure. It says, if you feel lacking, you must promise more. If promises are not enough, you must tighten further. And when effort fails to produce a sense of sufficiency, the loop begins again, with the same familiar voice. No one is forced to listen, but that voice is reinforced each year by the same ritual, the same timing, the same way of seeing. What is striking is how rarely this language is questioned. It sounds reasonable. Anyone can list things they wish to improve. Anyone can point to gaps. But the question seldom asked is this: why has lack become the default starting point for every beginning? Why is the feeling of being enough always pushed forward, like a reward reserved for the future? When the language of not quite enough becomes widespread, it shapes more than self-perception. It reshapes the experience of time itself. Each passing year is no longer simply time lived, but time that must be proven to have been used correctly. And from this shift, another pressure slowly forms, not the pressure to grow, but the pressure not to fall behind. A quiet pressure, accumulating, waiting to surface more clearly in moments when people find themselves among crowds, within shared rhythms, and inside the uneasy sense of standing among many others, all breathing the same air of expectation. When many people stand before the same threshold, personal feeling begins to change shape. It is no longer entirely one's own. It blends into a shared atmosphere, created through co-presence, eyes directed toward the same point, breathing unconsciously synchronized. Individual emotions, placed side by side, begin to resonate. Humans have long known that emotion can spread. A silent room can cause a newcomer to lower their voice without thinking. An excited crowd can pull in even those who arrived with no reason to feel excited. This is not mysticism. It is social biology. The human body is designed to adjust to the group, because for most of history, survival depended on sensing the rhythm of the community correctly. The final night of the year amplifies this phenomenon, not only because of the number of people involved, but because of the ritual synchronization, counting together, waiting together, hoping together. Within this atmosphere, private thoughts become easier to speak, easier to believe. A promise whispered inwardly, when placed among millions of other promises, no longer feels fragile. It is carried by the sense of not being alone in the desire to change. But the shared atmosphere does not amplify hope alone. It also magnifies subtler things. The anxiety of not being enough, the feeling that time is moving quickly, quiet comparisons with those nearby. When many people emit a similar emotional tone, that tone begins to feel normal. It is no longer recognized as pressure. It is experienced as the natural air of the moment. In moments like this, people easily confuse their own emotions with those of the collective. Personal unease is read as motivation. A sense of lack is interpreted as a sign that it is time to change. The shared atmosphere does not command. It suggests, and because the suggestion comes from everywhere at once, it is difficult to detect. What matters is that this atmosphere does not last. It peaks, then dissolves, but its imprint remains. Promises made in a state of co-presence carry the echo of collective strength, even after the person returns to private life. When that echo fades, a void appears, and within that void, people begin to wonder why the original feeling is gone. This disappointment is often misunderstood. It is not evidence that the promise lacked sincerity. It is evidence that the supporting atmosphere has dissipated. People rarely realize they borrowed the energy of the crowd to initiate a personal movement. When that energy withdraws, the movement becomes heavier, and the sense that something is off begins to form. At a deeper level, the shared atmosphere of the final night creates an emotional standard. It says, this is the time to hope, to be determined, to believe that next year will be different. When someone does not feel this way, they may assume they are out of sync. But being out of sync is not an error. It is simply a sign that the collective rhythm does not match the inner one. When collective atmosphere becomes an invisible measure, people learn to adjust their emotions accordingly. They learn when to expect, when to feel disappointed, when to promise. And when this adjustment repeats year after year, it slowly shapes a relationship with time, no longer grounded in personal sensation, but in harmonizing with the many. It is here that the story of the new year moves beyond personal ritual. It becomes a collective phenomenon, where emotion is generated, amplified, then dispersed in cycles. And within that cycle, a quiet question continues to repeat, rarely spoken aloud. If emotion can be guided by a shared rhythm, what happens to genuine presence? Once the crowd has dispersed and time continues to move in its own singular way, a quiet transformation has taken place in how humans experience time, not within a single century, but across generations. Time was once felt as a cycle returning, repeating, carrying new possibility with each changing season. Gradually, that circle was pulled straight. Time began to be told as a road, with a beginning, with an end, and every step unable to turn back. Within this structure, the new year is no longer a seasonal return. It becomes a new segment on a straight line. What has passed is gone. What has not yet arrived is the only remaining chance. This idea carries a subtle sense of urgency. No one needs to say that time is finite. The straight line already says it. It does not loop. It only moves forward. When time is felt as a line, each passing year acquires another weight. It is not only more life lived, it is life lost, a portion of time that cannot be recovered. And the question shifts from how one is living to whether one is moving fast enough along an invisible scale. That scale is not hung on a wall. It exists in how people measure themselves against age, achievement, and milestones deemed to be on time. The final night of the year makes this scale more visible than usual. When an entire year is named as over, a sense of loss can slip in. Even without any specific tragedy, another year has gone. Another stretch of the line has disappeared. And when this feeling is shared within a collective atmosphere, it becomes difficult to recognize. It is not called fear. It is called motivation. In linear structures, motivation is often built on the idea of lacking time. Move faster. Make use of it. Catch up. These phrases sound reasonable in a world governed by schedules, but they also carry a clear psychological consequence. Presence is pushed aside. People live more in memory and projection, and less in the moment unfolding now. When the past is treated as irretrievable, it easily turns into regret. When the future is seen as the only remaining possibility, it easily fills with pressure. The present, pulled between these two directions, grows thin. It becomes merely a transition point, not a place to dwell. And when the present is not treated as a dwelling place, people begin to fill it with plans, goals, and promises aimed ahead. This helps explain why New Year promises lean so strongly toward the future and so rarely speak of how to live right now. They are born to counter the sense that time is slipping away too quickly. But by placing all hope on the stretch ahead, they unintentionally reinforce the very structure that creates anxiety. The more the straight line is emphasized, the stronger the sense of loss becomes. In cultures that preserve a circular sense of time, passing does not equal losing. Seasons return, opportunities return, mistakes are not stamped as permanent. But in a linear sense, every step is a door closing behind. And when that door is imagined as locked, fear begins to emerge, even if no one names it. The final night of the year, then, is not only a welcoming ritual, it is the moment when the straight line is made most visible. One segment ends, another opens, and between them, people stand still for a brief instant, sensing dimly that they are moving closer to a final limit. Not the limit of a year, but the limit of lived time itself. There is a feeling rarely spoken of on the final night of the year, yet it lingers at the edge of every ritual. It is not loud, not dramatic. It is a faint awareness that time is quietly closing doors that cannot be reopened. Not that a year is ending, but that another portion of life has slipped away silently, without asking permission. This feeling does not need words to exist. It appears in small moments. When someone looks at an old photograph and cannot quite remember how they felt at the time. When a well-wishing phrase sounds so familiar that it no longer reaches inward. When laughter erupts too quickly after midnight, as if to fill a space that has just opened. No one speaks of it, yet everyone senses it in their own way. Within a linear structure of time, each passing year carries an unspoken message. What lies behind has closed. And even if no one calls this loss, the body responds as though something has departed. Not a person, not an event, but a possibility. A chance to fully live a moment that was not fully lived when it occurred. The final night of the year sharpens this awareness because it compresses an entire year into a single frame. A long sequence of days is pressed into a few minutes of reflection, and when things are compressed, their weight increases. Words never spoken, paths not taken, choices that have closed. All of it rises, not as clear memory, but as a background pressure, difficult to trace to any single source. Because this pressure is uncomfortable, it is often covered quickly, with noise, with light, with promises, with plans for the future. Not because people wish to escape, but because culture offers little language for staying with the feeling of finitude. When language is absent, ritual takes its place. It provides another story to tell, one in which a new beginning can soften the anxiety of irreversible endings. But this anxiety does not disappear. It only relocates. When not faced directly, it transforms into pressure to make use of time, to move faster, to do things right, to avoid waste. These demands sound reasonable in a measured world, yet they also tighten time itself. Every moment not used properly begins to carry a trace of guilt, even when no accusation is made. What is subtle is that anxiety about finitude rarely appears as fear outright. It appears as motivation, as determination, as promise. It wears shapes that society accepts, allowing it to remain without being recognized. And because of this, people often fail to see that what is driving them is not only the desire to live better, but also an unease before time's refusal to wait. In cultures bound to cycles, finitude is framed differently. Endings do not mean disappearance. They are conditions for return. But when time is told as a straight line, endings feel absolute. And the final night of the year, with all its light and hope, unintentionally highlights that absoluteness. If only briefly, long enough for the body to register it. Perhaps this is why ritual must continue, not only for one night, but through many layered actions. Because if one were to linger too long in that quiet gap, a clearer question would emerge. If each passing year is a door closing behind us, where are we truly moving toward? And it is this question, never fully asked, that begins to guide the story toward its final movement, where time is no longer faced as an adversary, but as a space to inhabit, if one dares to change how one stands within it. There is an old possibility, rarely mentioned in stories about the new year. It does not live in ritual, it does not live in promises, and it does not require a marked moment. The possibility is so simple that it is easily overlooked, beginning the moment one realizes where one is. In rhythms bound to seasons, a beginning is not an event, it is a response. When the soil softens, seeds sprout. When days lengthen, work opens. There is no ceremonial moment declaring that a season has begun. The season arrives through signs, and humans, if they listen closely enough, simply step with it. Change in this structure does not need grand promises, because it is supported by context. When beginnings are separated from context, people are compelled to create doors, a date, a number, a right moment. But doors, though necessary in some structures, have side effects. They teach people to believe that outside of those doors, beginning is illegitimate, that the present, if it does not fall on the correct marker, is merely waiting, a space to be endured. The forgotten possibility lives here, not because it vanished, but because it stopped being named. The ability to begin from presence rather than from the calendar. The ability to adjust rhythm through feeling rather than through promises. The ability to make small, steady changes that do not demand witnesses. Changes that make no noise, yet endure. This does not deny the value of ritual. Ritual once played an essential role when humans needed frames to cross difficult thresholds. But when ritual becomes a mandatory condition for every beginning, it begins to obscure the natural movements that occur daily. A quiet decision, a habit gently shifted, a choice to stay a little longer with a moment, instead of rushing to fill it. Within linear structures, change is told as a leap, before and after, success and failure. But within circular rhythm, change is a gradual tilt. There is no explosion point, no anniversary, only a direction held long enough to become a new form. This difference is difficult to see from the outside, but the body recognizes it clearly. Perhaps this is why many profound changes in human life are not tied to the first day of the year. They are tied to ordinary moments, a morning with no plan, a conversation that subtly alters the course of thought, a pause taken at the right moment, instead of forcing one more step. These moments are rarely named as beginnings, yet they are often where everything truly shifts. When this possibility is forgotten, too much expectation is placed on rare doors. Each new year becomes a burden, each promise becomes a test, and each failure reinforces the sense of lack. But when this possibility is remembered even quietly, the door loses its absolute power. Not because it is destroyed, but because it is no longer the only path. Perhaps the deepest thing the final night unintentionally obscures is not some grand truth, but something very simple, that time is not only something to pass through, but something to inhabit. And that beginning, when not forced to stand before a door, can occur in any moment in which one is present enough to recognize readiness, to change how one stands within that very moment. When every ritual has dissolved, when the lights are dimmed, when the room returns to its ordinary rhythm of breathing, the final night of the year leaves behind a very particular kind of space. Not a clear ending, just the sense that something has settled. Like the ground after snowfall stops, like a house after the guests have gone, time continues to move. The clock does not pause to confirm that a door has been crossed. The sun will rise in the morning, regardless of the number written on the calendar. Yet within this rare quiet, another possibility appears. Not loudly, not by name, simply the chance to remain with the moment that is happening, without pulling it backward into memory, and without pushing it forward into expectation. Seen this way, the final night of the year is not a deceiver, it is a mirror. It reflects how humans have learned to face time, through doors, through promises, through measurement, through the quiet fear that without marking, everything would pass without meaning. But a mirror does not command, it only reveals. There are those who still need ritual, who still need the door, and there is nothing wrong with that. Humans have always needed forms to contain what feels too vast. But there are also those who begin to sense that not every beginning needs to be witnessed. Not every change requires a special day to be valid. That sometimes, what is most profound does not occur at the threshold, but in how one remains after the threshold has already passed. Time, when not forced into a straight line, can open into a space, a place to inhabit, not merely to traverse. In that space, the present is no longer a thin point pulled between two directions. It becomes the ground, and upon that ground, small movements, steady, unnamed, can unfold without vows. Perhaps this is what older rhythms once understood. not through concepts, but through living. That light returns when it is ready. That seasons change without announcement. That life does not require a number to grant permission to continue. When the memory of this way of living faded, humans created ritual to replace it. But memory, even when covered, rarely disappears entirely. When the final night closes, what remains is not whether promises were kept or broken, not the plans for the months ahead, but a quiet question, perhaps never fully spoken. If time is not only something to be crossed, but something to dwell within, how might one stand inside it, when there is no longer a door that needs to be opened? That question does not need an immediate answer. It only needs to be carried, quietly, into unmarked days. For it is there, far from ritual light and countdowns, that time begins to whisper in its own way. And sometimes, within that silence, something very old can be heard returning not as a command, but as permission to be present, fully, in this moment.